Hi, everyone. I'm Faisal. I'm the CTO of Eirene and CTO and co-founder. Eirene allows families to plan an affordable cremation entirely online at your convenience. And one of the things that I've been involved with for the past, 10 years now is building software and building scalable software. And most recently, I've been using serverless a lot, and that's what I'm here to talk about. Like I said, I've been developing software for the past 10 years, and one of the trends that I saw, especially while building startups, was I consistently had to spend a lot of time specifically making sure that my software is scaling up properly. All the management and DevOps when I rather should be building the business. Most of my businesses have always been very non-tech heavy, but they have a very critical tech concept, they're tech powered. And so I just didn't want to consistently be focused on how to figure out how to, the latest technology to scale up. And I just wanted to write code and move on to the business. You know, Traditionally the challenges I faced was just around building, massive scalable stuff. And with serverless, those challenges went away. And that really excited me. But serverless itself brought a whole bunch of new challenges and kind of rethinking how you do things. If you start with just cloud functions specifically, it was this mind shift that now my code, which was this mono repo, I guess, or even multiple repos, but the way you wrote code kind of changed. Where specifically with Google Cloud Functions that I'm very familiar with, you had to kind of rethink in terms of a function-based system rather than writing typically in Node.js. You would write like an interface with Express. You would set up your routes, and then you would have a bunch of classes with with Cloud Functions, you have to rethink how you wrote that. And that was a big challenge. But then over time, I saw that there was a lot more frameworks that developed like serverless, which is a open source library on GitHub that kind of lets you organize code. And then the big thing that came up recently, I guess in the past year and a half, was Cloud Run, where I can go back to how I've been developing software um, in a monorepo style, or and kind of just have a Docker container that builds everything. And instead of deploying to Heroku or Kubernetes, I can just deploy to serverless again. So that solved a lot of my challenges regarding architecture and just building out good software. But then there was another challenge that I recently ran into is around background processing. And I don't know if how much people have used serverless, but one of the limitations of serverless is you can't have software run all the time. You can't have your function run all the time. Eventually, it will time out. I think Lambdas and Cloud Functions have a 7 minute timeout. Cloud Run has a 15-minute timeout. So the big thing was, well, how do you do background processing? I imagine you have a batch job that you trigger and it's supposed to run for like 3 hours. How would you handle that? And so that was a big challenge, specifically around a product that I was building actually just before I was working on Eirene, where we had to do large batch processing jobs. And serverless was the right technology, and I just didn't want to introduce Kubernetes or a virtual machine. So one of the things I did, which worked really well, and I actually got this idea from my brother, who's actually built a startup right now called Increment on the Slack App Store, and they what they do is, and what he told me to do, and it worked really well, was when you're doing background processing, I would basically wait, do the processing for say 2 minutes, and then put a checkpoint and save that checkpoint of data into say something like Redis or MySQL, and then recursively call the cloud function again. And this would you would get around the time limits, and then you can completely do an entire batch processing job on serverless. Yeah, I mean, like I just said, one of the challenges was definitely kind of doing the background processing and overcoming that. The other challenge that I faced and I came, yeah, was around connection pooling. One of the things when you're writing in a traditional, I guess, pattern, you deploy it to EC2, you kind of have an idea of how many connections you have to a database. With serverless, specifically something like Lambda, you don't have any control over how many lambdas will get created. So maybe, imagine your site suddenly gets featured on Hacker News. You might get 1,000 hits, and suddenly you have 1,000 open connections, mainly because serverless is stateless. There's no way to kind of maintain this proxy, this connection pool to the database. And so one of the ways I overcame that is I created another Lambda. I created unfortunately, another virtual machine that connected to my Cloud SQL via a Cloud SQL proxy. So that worked really well. That was like one, it wasn't entirely serverless, but that was one solution. I've also heard that there are other solutions now that Google talks about, but I have yet to try those. I would say, 99% of the time, serverless is a good choice. Um, I personally think that if you're building a startup, if you're, bootstrapped early on, then serverless makes a lot of sense. There's use cases where it doesn't, specifically on machine learning workloads, or lots of, my data processing background task hack, or my brother's hack is, good, but it's not intended for a long-term solution. It's not like you're supposed to be processing like terabytes of data. So if you're doing, analysis and machine learning stuff, serverless is not good for you. However, with that said, you could still have, a GPU machine doing all your machine learning workloads, and then have serverless for everything else. It's just one less thing to worry about. So I definitely recommend everyone try serverless. The beauty about something like Cloud Run on Google Cloud is you just don't even have to think about serverless anymore. Like, in terms of your code, it's very agnostic. You just, at the end of the day, have to have a Docker container, and you deploy it to a Cloud Run, and it just works like magic, right? As long as you're within your request or within the 15-minute limit, it works beautifully. I guess one thing that I'm hoping for, and I actually wrote this down in the morning because I was going through, what are some features I want, is what are the flaws, not flaws, but just by design, the way serverless works is, because it's so cheap, Google, Azure, Microsoft, Amazon just can't keep your server running all the time. You might as well just use EC2. And so what they do is they kind of spin down your server. And then when someone hits it again, it's, boots up again. Now, for an app that's constantly being hit with traffic, this is not so much of a concern. You can kind of ping your instance and keep it warm. But when you're scaling up dramatically, you might start to see some lag because there's more instances being booted up. And so what I would like to see, and Cloudflare actually is coming out with this, is they're always keeping an instance hot. And I would love to see Google and Amazon and Azure kind of adopt this always hot strategy. In fact, I think just 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, Cloud Run on Google has this minimum instance parameter now where you can say, I always want to keep at least one instance running. It doesn't specifically solve all the issues, but it's a step in the right direction, and I totally recommend using Cloud Run for that. So that's one of the features that I'd like in the future. The other one, and Cloud Run kind of solves this problem, is around testing. With Cloud Run, you have a Docker build, you can run all your CI/CD tests, everything's good to go, you deploy it. With Cloud Functions, you're just deploying like a JavaScript file that is kind of hooked into this module exports, at least when you're doing Node.js Cloud Function development. And so there's no real good way to build testing around that. So I'd love to see better options around, maybe pre-test all your Cloud Functions before they get pushed to production. cost, right? It's dirt cheap to run a startup. Um, to give you context, Irene just recently launched, but and so we're it's not like we're getting a million hits per day. But previously, I was running a startup, um, which was a chat app, and it was getting consistent traffic. Probably about I would say 10,000 daily active users, and it was serverless, cloud functions, cloud run, as well as Firestore. And I remember running a similar business back in 2012 on DigitalOcean and then eventually moving to Google Cloud. And that business cost me about $500 a month to run. And simply because I had to have a VM, I had to scale up, load balancer, bunch of stuff. And this was pre Kubernetes as well. Not that Kubernetes would be any cheaper. And I remember, my co-founder and I got back together and we said, let's try this business again. We gave it another go. And this time around, I adopted the serverless strategy. And the business literally cost me $20 a month to run with the same usage, the same data patterns. And so reflecting back, I remember telling my co-founder, like, man, I wish we had that early on because we could have saved so much money. And so, this just cost savings are a big thing. And then the second is just operations. I remember when I was running the original business in 2012, kind of hiking in the woods, but having my phone glued to me because if the server went down, I had to SSH in and like do all sorts of crap to make sure it's running again. But with cloud functions and cloud run, if the server goes down, like I can't do anything. Google has to deal with it, right? So my DevOps is kind of shifted. That's a pro and a con. If you're doing a mission critical thing, you can't just go, well, I hope Google figures this out. But it wasn't a mission critical startup. It was all right for a downtime of 20, 30 minutes. And so just having that peace of mind that I don't have to wake up in the middle of the night, figuring out what's wrong with the server, it was amazing. So I definitely recommend, any business looking into optimizing yourself and kind of focus so you can focus on, I guess, product market fit without having to worry about your technology. I definitely recommend using serverless.
This was a great experience listening to Faisal talk about how he used serverless computing to build a startup. If you liked what Faisal told in this video, hit the like button. And we are going to be talking to many other developers who are using serverless to build their applications or startups. If you want to get notified every time we post a video, hit that subscribe button and click that notification icon so that you will get notified as soon as we publish the video. It was great talking to you, Faisal. Thank you very much.